Hello and welcome, my name is Ryan, I'm also known as RM2KDev. Now in this video we're going to be doing another core data video, but today we're going to be doing a custom NSManagedObject class. So basically what this means is we're going to be we're going to be inheriting from the NSManagedObject and creating a class of our own, and we're going to be able to basically serialize and deserialize this information into the database for persistent storage. So I'm going to create an empty application. I'm going to make sure the use core data function down here is selected, and I'm going to call this core data custom object video for the moment. I'm going to select next and create that into my system in the appropriate location. Now once this is done, jump into your app delegate, and we're just going to get rid of all of these self.window commands here. Actually, one thing I'll do just quickly is increase my font size so that everyone can read. There we go. So I just gotten rid of the self.window what would you call it? Self.window variables and their code associated with them, as that's going to create a blank window for our project, and we don't need that since we're going to be using storyboards. Now that that's been deleted, I'm going to create a new file in our project. It's going to be of type user interface storyboard. It's going to be for the iPhone, and I'm just going to leave that named storyboard by default, and that's going to create us a blank storyboard. So down here in the bottom right hand corner of our screen, I'm going to drag a view controller into our app, and I'm also going to drag in two text boxes and two buttons. So I'm just going to drag those over now, text field. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, there is a simple, oops, I don't want to drag all of them. There is a cool little trick that you can do. If you place a control onto your view, as I'm doing here, if you hold down the Alt key, you can click and drag and you'll get another instance of the same control. So it's just a bit of a time saver there, something that you guys can use. So I'm going to do the same thing for the button. I'm going to hold Alt and click and drag, and I'll get a second button. We're going to call this button here. Now this is the same interface that we created in the other core data video. I'm going to use this interface for most of my core data videos. I'm going to call this one here save, and I'm going to call this one here load. Now that we've got our view set up, we can create a view controller for this view. So I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be a source file, and it's going to be of type CocoaTouch class. This is going to inherit from UI view controller. Let's type UI view controller, and I'm going to call this VC main. That's going to stand for view controller main. Now just create that and save that in the appropriate location, and you're going to end up with a file like this. So what we do now is we're going to get rid of this initialize function, as we don't need it since the storyboard is going to handle that for us. I'm also going to get rid of this pragma mark navigation function as well, and I'm just going to collapse down these two viewDidLoad and viewDidReceiveMemory functions, as we're not going to be using those in this video either. So from this point, what we need to do is we need to create a few IB outlets to represent those text fields and two IB actions to represent the buttons. So I'm going to create two IB outlets. The first one is going to be called var. The first one is going to be called text username, just like our previous video, UI text field. There we go. The second one is going to be called var text password, txt password, and it's also going to be a UI text field, and I'll put that with the exclamation mark as well. Now we're also going to need two actions, so I'm going to create an IB action. I'm going to call this one here function btn save underscore clicked, and I'm going to add another action, IB action func btn load underscore clicked, and that's going to do it for the structure of our first view controller. Now back in our storyboard, we need to associate this view to that view controller. So I'm going to select the view just by creating a rectangle around it. I'm going to go to our, I think it is the third icon along this, the identity inspector, and we're going to change the custom class If we scroll down to the bottom, we're going to change that to VC main. What that means is that this view controller is now going to have all of the properties that we've just created inside of this view controller here. So back on our storyboard, I'm going to link up these two text fields simply by right-clicking on that and creating a new referencing outlet to the view controller, and that's going to be text username. I'm going to do the same for the password. That's going to be a referencing outlet, and that's going to be text password. Then we do the same thing for the buttons, however this time it's going to be touch up inside, and I'm going to change that one to button save clicked. And I'm going to do the same thing for the load button, touch up inside, and I'm going to drag that over and put that one on btn load. So at this point our view has now been linked to our view controller. If we quickly just run our application to make sure that it is working, and I'll bring across the iPhone simulator, there it is, and you'll notice that it is not working. That is because we need to come to our project here in the top left and set our main interface to be the storyboard that we just created. So I'm going to run that project again, and now you'll see that the project is working. These events have been tied together. You can type in these text fields and click these buttons, and they will be firing those associated events in the view controller. We just don't have any code for that yet. So now this is a video on core data. So I'm going to start by creating a new entity. So if you come to your core data file and create a new entity, I'm going to call this one here users, and it's going to have two attributes. The first attribute is going to be a username, and the second attribute is going to be a password. These are both going to be of type string. So once that's done, you are pretty much done with your data model. So this is our data model. That has been completed. The next thing that we need to do is we're going to add a custom object for this data model. Now, if you right-click on your project and create a new file, if you go to core data, you'll see that you can actually create a NSManagedObject subclass. Now this is actually what we want to create. However, this creates an Objective-C NSManaged subclass. So now we want a Swift one. Unfortunately, there isn't a template for this yet, so we have to create this from scratch, but thankfully it's quite easy. So I'm just going to create a Cocoa Touch file. Let me just double check. Yes, I'm going to create a Cocoa Touch file, and it's going to inherit from subclass of NSManagedObject. I'm going to call this class users to match the data model that we've created, and it's going to be in a language of Swift. And we're going to create that in our project, and what you'll see is we get this file here. I'm just going to get rid of these comments here as they're not needed. So now we have our data class, which is implementing NSManagedObject. You'll see it's giving us an error telling us that we haven't used it. Basic undeclared, use of undeclared type NSManagedObject. That's because we need to import core data. So I'm going to type import core data at the top of this file, and that will resolve that issue. We may get another warning later saying that there's no properties, but we're going to fix that now. So inside of this class, we're going to create two NSManaged properties, and these are going to map back to our attributes in our users table, our users entity. So to do that, I'm just going to create a @NSManaged. This is basically telling the compiler that this will be managed by core data, this variable. So I'm going to say var username, and it's going to be the same type string, not strong, sorry, string. I'm going to do the same thing for the password. It's @NSManaged var password. It's also going to be a string, and that's going to do it for our data class. At this point, we're going to jump back into our view controller, and we're going to start creating the functionality to save these users into the database. So in order to save using our core data, if you've watched the previous video, you will know that we're going to need a reference to our application delegate. We're also going to need a reference to the managed object context inside of that application delegate, and then we can start to create the object that we're actually going to be saving into our SQLite database. So we'll start this by simply getting a reference to our application delegate. So I'm going to say let appdel, it's going to be equal to application delegate, because we're basically saying it was going to be a object of this type here, which is the class that we have made for us that has the NSManagedObject inside of it. And it's going to be equal to the UI application dot shared application dot delegate, and we're going to say as application delegate. So we're basically just going to cast the delegate that we get back to an application delegate that we can actually use. From this point, we're going to say let context, and this is going to be the context that we use to reference our NSManagedObject context. It's going to be of type NSManagedObject context. Sorry, if we're missing that, that's because we need to import our core data at the top of our file here to gain access to these classes. NSManagedObject context. And that's going to be equal to the app delegate that we've just got back, and that contains a managed object context inside of it. So we need to get a reference to that context. So from this point on, we're now able to access our database. Now, because we're using this custom users class, and it is basically a subclass of NSManagedObject, it provides the same properties, but we're telling the compiler that we're going to be using core data to handle this using this @NSManaged function. We're able to create instances of that class and actually populate those fields and save that straight into our database. So I'm going to say var ent, because we need to get our entity. Actually, no, I want to say let. I'll say let ent equal ns entity description, and we're going to say entity for name. Now the name of the entity that we want to get is going to be users, because that's the entity inside of our core data data model, and the managed context that we're going to use is going to be context, and that's the context that we got back from our application delegate. From this point, we're able to create an instance of our users class. I'm going to say var new user is going to be equal to a instance of users. And when I put the bracket to initiate this, we're going to get two constructors. The first constructor we're not going to use, but the second constructor we're going to use. And that basically asks us which entity would we like to use. So we're going to use ent, the entity that we just created, which is a reference to the users table inside of our data, inside of our context, which is our NSManagedObject context, the reference to our core data SQLite file. And the managed context that we want to insert this into is going to be the context that we have already got again. Now with the new user, we can now say new user, and we get access to the properties that we created before. Those were username and password. So for username, I'm just going to use txt username.text, and for the password, I'm going to do the same thing. .password equals txt password.text. Now that we have our user set up, we can go ahead and save our context. And basically, by creating this user and filling out these details, we're basically creating an object that's going to be inserted into our context simply by calling context.save. It will ask for an NS error pointer, but I'm going to provide nil for this since we're not going to handle the errors in this project. However, if you did wish to handle these errors, you would simply make a reference to, sorry, let me just get that command back, .save, and NS error pointer, and then handle the error appropriately. But for this, I'm just going to use nil. At this point, we can now print our user to the console just to make sure that the data is correct. So I'm going to say print ln, and I'm going to pass in our user, new user, and I'm also going to say print ln object saved. Now if I run the application, this should be saving our user based on the username and password text that we enter into these fields here. Ryan is going to be my username, and my password is going to be 123456. If I select save, you'll see that we now get the console window appearing. If I resize that a little bit, you'll see the data, the username and the password was set, and the object saved was called. Now, in order to load this information back, we're going to be using a Very similar setup, except this time we'll be using a fetch request and an NS predicate to basically filter our data down and perform a search on that data. So jump into our btn load underscore clicked function. We're going to copy these first two lines here from the button save. And these are going to provide us with a reference to our application delegate and our context for our data. From this point, we need to get a request going, because we basically need to request information from our database. So I'm going to say let request equal ns fetch request, and the data that we pass across to that is going to be the name of our entity, which is going to be users, as this is the entity that we want to get the data from. Next, we need to say request. Oh, sorry, I spelled that wrong. Request dot return objects as false. We need to set this to false, and the reason we need to set this to false is core data actually won't return us the object. It will return us a list with the same number of objects in it that we're going to get back from this query, but it actually won't contain the objects that we're looking for. By setting return objects as false to false, it will actually return us an instance of the object that we're looking for. Now at this point, we can then create our we can actually execute our fetch request or create a predicate. I'm going to create a predicate by saying request dot predicate equals ns predicate, and in brackets, when I initialize that, it's going to be the format, which one is it? This one. Format, where it provides a string and then an array of arguments after. I'm going to say username equals %at. Now the %at will be replaced by the first argument, because arguments is an array. If we had %at, the second argument would be the second parameter of the array. Sorry, the second index of the array. So our parameter for this is going to be text username.text, as that's the data that we want to look for. Now we can execute our request simply by saying var results, and I'm going to say that is an ns array. It's going to be equal to context.execute fetch request. The request is going to be the request that we just created, and for error I'm going to do nil again with the same reason above. If you do want to handle the errors, just create an ns error pointer and handle it appropriately. Now that we have an array of results back, we can simply say something like if results.count is greater than 0, else do this. So I'm going to say println no results found, and if results were found, I'm going to say println, and I'm going to say can we say here, we can say results.count found. Oops, what if I spelled results wrong? I think I spelled results wrong in my declaration. There we go. So now let's save our project and run that and quickly have a look what we get back. If I select load, you'll see that no results were found. If I put Ryan in and select load, you'll see that one result was found. Now that we've got the result, I'm going to show you guys an error that I encountered while creating this tutorial and the solution to this, so that hopefully anyone who's encountered these sort of errors is able to overcome them in the future. So now that we've got an array of results back, we're going to create a for loop, and I'm going to say for user in results. And this is going to create a for loop that basically goes through each of the results, and we're just going to print out the user to the console. So I'm going to say the first thing we do is we're going to try and attempt to cast this user back into a object of our NSManagedObject here, sorry, a type of our custom subclass user. We'll do that simply by saying var this user equals user as user. That might look a little complicated, but basically we are attempting to cast the user that we're talking about in this context to the user class that we have created earlier. and that's user, sorry, not user. Now that we have an instance of our user in our proper class, in a type of our proper user class that we created here, we now get access back to the properties that we had before. So if I say the user.username, oh, we have some sort of issue going on here. This user.username, you'll see that we have access to the property username and password as if it was a proper object. So now we could print to the console, print ln, I want to say the users, oops, I need to put those in quotes, the users username is, and then we use our backslash parentheses notation to say this user.username. That's going to inject that into this string here. Now you're going to see an error when I run this. So I'm going to run this and I'm just going to show you guys what happens. If I attempt to load the information, no results come back. Obviously this section of code is not running. If I were to put my name into the username field and do a lookup on that, no results. I think I used capital R, that might be why. And do a load, you'll see that we get this error. And it's in the libswift standard library core, and it's attempting to do a dynamic cast. Now this, I spent quite a while trying to figure out what this error was. Now what's happening is it's this line here where we're trying to cast the user into our actual class of user so that we get access to the friendly properties as before, so that we don't have to do those find by key and find by string in order to get the properties out of the NSManagedObject. Now the issue was that Objective-C was unable to find this class because from my understanding, the core data library is written in Objective-C and it doesn't have access to our users class. So we need to make our users available to the Objective-C namespace simply by typing @objc and then in brackets the name that we want to provide. So we're saying that this class is going to be presented to Objective-C using the same name as it is presented to Swift. Now in doing this, we've made our class available to the Objective-C libraries, therefore core data should be able to find our class, and this cast should now be valid. So let's run our application again. I'm going to have a quick look for my name. I'm going to select load, and we get the same error. Okay, so I missed one step. We have to go into our data model and into our users. If you select on configuration C, you'll see the entity. We need to map this user's entity into a user's class. And that basically tells core data that this class of users is going to be relating to this entity of users. Once you've done that, if we go back to our main view controller, we'll just have a look at our code one more time. We're basically looping through the results, then we're attempting to cast the result that we get back into an instance of our users class, and then we gain access to the properties that we've defined inside of users. So if we run the application again, and I type my name into the first text box, and select load, you'll see that it has found one user. And it also says the user's username is Ryan. Now, a benefit of this doing it this way is, one, it gets easier to manage our data, so we don't have to be doing these lookups that we were doing before in the previous video, and the set value and value for key functions, and casting things to string. And also the other thing you'll notice is the bug that I had in the previous video is fixed. We can now use the text username.text and text password.text. Doing it this way also gives us some interesting data management options. Because we actually have a class representing the data that we're trying to store in the database, we can attach additional functionality to this. So an example that I'm going to do here is I'm going to say create a new function, and I'm just going to call this one toString. Now obviously a user is not going to have a toString method, but this is just an example. I'm going to return a string from this function, and the string I'm going to return is basically, I'm just going to say return. It's basically going to be a concatenation of both the username and the password. So I'm going to say the username is for backslash and parentheses. Their password is, and then our parentheses, and I'm going to say password and username. Now I'm also going to create another function, and I'm going to call this one, oh sorry, not function, just func. I'm going to add another function, and this one's going to be called add funny prefix. Prefix? Yeah, prefix. Now this is going to take a property, and I'm just going to call this one here prefix, and it's going to be a string, and it doesn't return anything. But what it does do is it changes the username. So if I say username equals, and I'm just going to create another string, I'm just going to say forward slash, I'm just going to say prefix, and then I'm going to say the same thing, username. Now you could do it the way that I've done it here, username. You could also do it like this, username equals prefix plus username. It's up to you which way you do it. Swift is very open in the way that it lets you write your language. So I'm just going to do it this way. And basically, we now get access to these two functions whenever we get an object back from the database. So the first one I'm going to show you is the toString method. So instead of printing out our regular message here, I'm just going to say this user dot to, not this sir, this user dot toString. And what we should see is the object comes back, populates those properties. We call the toString function on that object, and it will actually execute in its context. So what you'll see is the username is Ryan, their password is test. If I stop the project, we come back here. I can now call this user dot funny, what did I call that function? Prefix. Oh, I can't remember what I called the function. It was called add funny prefix. So this user dot add funny prefix, it's going to be ha ha. There we go. I'll put a hyphen as well just to make it look nice. And then if I say print ln, and I'm going to say this user dot toString, what you should see now is the user will come back from the database. It will say the username is Ryan and their password is test. Then we call the funny prefix function, passing in a string, and then we ask the user what its name is again, and it will say this time the username is haha Ryan and the password is test. So if I do a lookup on my user, what you should see is the username is Ryan, the username is haha Ryan. So that's how we create a custom subclass object from the NSManagedObject and tie that in with core data. This lets you do a lot of cool things like, add these functions. You'll be able to overwrite and change the data. It'll be useful for an actual practical useful case. In this example would be something like a valid password function. So valid password, which takes a string, and it's going to be called input password, and it's going to be a string, and it returns a boolean value. So I'm just going to say a bool. There we go. And inside of this function, you would do something like, there we go. You would do something like if input password is equal to password, then return true, else return false. And that needs to be double equals. And this is going to be the sort of functionality that you would add to this user object. So when the user comes back from the database, you're able to perform a validate password check on that user, which will return a true or false. It's just a simple example of how we can use a custom subclass NSManagedObject. So I hope you liked this video. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the section below, and enjoy your Swift learning days. Thank you guys. Bye.